They stood in silence as the ground trembled beneath their feet. Dust rose into the air, carrying the distant thunder of marching boots and war drums that never seemed to end. Ahead of them stretched a horizon completely blackened by movement, an endless sea of soldiers pouring forward like a living tide. 400 warriors watched it all, knowing with terrifying clarity that this was not a battle meant to be survived. The air smelled of sweat, iron, and fear. Armor tightened around chests that rose and fell too quickly, hearts pounding louder than any horn. Some men whispered prayers. Others stared forward with empty eyes, already imagining the moment steel would tear through flesh. Every instinct screamed to run, yet no one moved. There was nowhere to run. Behind them stood everything they loved. In front of them stood an army that could erase them without slowing down. Numbers stopped feeling real.
100,000 was no longer a count, but a force of nature, like a storm rolling in to swallow the land whole. The ground shook harder with every step the enemy took closer, each vibration a reminder of how small 400 truly were. History had written this moment 1,000 times before, and it always ended the same way. Commanders on the distant hills raised their banners, confident, almost bored. They had seen resistance before. They had crushed it every time. To them, this was not a fight, but a delay, a brief inconvenience before inevitable victory. The 400 understood this too. They were not expected to win. They were not expected to live. Their role was simple: break, die, and be forgotten. Yet something strange happened in that crushing certainty of death. Fear did not vanish, but it hardened. Hands stopped shaking. Breathing slowed. If this was the place where everything ended, then it would end on their terms. No one spoke of glory or survival.
Those dreams had already been stripped away. What remained was resolve, sharp and unyielding. As the first enemy horn sounded and the sea of soldiers began to surge forward, the 400 tightened their formation. Shields locked, weapons lifted. In that frozen heartbeat before impact, time itself seemed to hesitate, as if history was holding its breath. Because what was about to unfold was not supposed to happen. Against every law of war, logic, and reason, this doomed stand would carve a scar so deep that empires would remember it for centuries. And as the distance between the 400 and the 100,000 vanished, the world was about to witness one of history's most impossible moments. This was the instant where myths are born and logic collapses under pressure. The next moments would decide whether courage could delay annihilation, or whether the earth would simply drink more blood and move on, indifferent. As the lines closed, destiny leaned forward, waiting.
For them, survival was impossible, but defiance still had time to speak to the world forever. The world beyond that battlefield was already cracking apart. An empire was rising with a hunger that could not be satisfied, driven by ambition, fear, and the belief that expansion was survival. Borders were not lines on maps anymore, but invitations to conquer. Every victory fed the machine, and every conquest demanded the next, faster and larger than before. At the center of it all stood power, measured in land, tribute, and obedience. Armies moved not only to defeat enemies, but to send messages: submit or be erased. Cities fell, kings bent the knee, and entire cultures disappeared into footnotes. Resistance was treated as an inconvenience, crushed to preserve momentum. The empire's strength seemed limitless, its confidence unshakable. Yet expansion always creates pressure. Supply lines stretched thin, control weakened at the edges, and fear of rebellion grew louder with every mile gained.
To stop meant vulnerability. To slow down meant inviting challengers. So the empire pushed forward, even when the ground beneath it became unstable. This battle was not chosen for honor or strategy. It was chosen because retreat was unthinkable. For the lands ahead, the stakes were absolute. If the invading force passed through unchecked, there would be no second chance. Fortresses would fall one by one, Trade routes would collapse, and populations would be swallowed into an unfamiliar order. The world would not merely change rulers, it would lose its identity. This was not a clash of armies, but a collision of futures. Against this unstoppable momentum stood fragile resistance, not a nation with endless resources, but communities bound by survival and memory. They understood what conquest meant because they had seen it elsewhere: burned fields, broken families, erased histories. They knew that if the line broke here, nothing behind them would hold.
That was why this battlefield mattered. It was never about winning in the traditional sense. It was about buying time, sending a message, and forcing the empire to bleed where it believed itself untouchable. The invaders saw only another obstacle. The defenders saw the final door between their world and oblivion. Both sides understood that history rarely announces its turning points. Decisions made in distant capitals had funneled everything toward this narrow strip of land. Generals spoke of numbers and logistics, but the people living here spoke only of survival. Every road, river, and hill now carried weight beyond its size. What happened in the next hours would ripple outward, reshaping alliances, fears, and ambitions far beyond the battlefield itself. No one present could fully grasp how close the world was to changing direction forever in ways no prophecy could predict. And yet, for all the grand forces at play, history was about to narrow its focus.
Because the fate of empires often turns not on thrones or councils, but on the backs of a few who refuse to step aside. This is not the story of the empire that marched forward. It is the story of the 400 who stood in its way. They were not born as legends. Before this moment, they were farmers who knew the rhythm of seasons, craftsmen whose hands were shaped by tools, and soldiers who had learned discipline through repetition, not glory. Each man carried a past that had nothing to do with destiny. They had homes behind them, names spoken by children, and lives that once felt permanent. Training had hardened their bodies, but it had not erased fear. They knew the weight of armor after long marches, the ache in muscles that never fully rested, and the quiet dread that settled in the chest before battle. Courage was not the absence of fear for them. It was the decision to stand despite it. Around campfires, they spoke softly of families, unfinished dreams, in the hope that this campaign would not be their last. Some had volunteered believing the threat could be stopped early. Others were ordered forward with little choice. None imagined they would become the final barrier against an empire. Rank mattered less here than trust. They relied on the man beside them, not for heroics, but for survival. Shield to shield, breath to breath, they learned to move as one. There were no speeches promising immortality, no illusions of triumph. Their leaders spoke plainly, grounding them in reality rather than fantasy. This honesty bound them together more tightly than any myth ever could. They were not promised victory, they were promised that their stand would matter. As the enemy drew closer, doubt crept in quietly. Some men questioned whether this sacrifice would be remembered, or simply erased like so many others before it. Others wondered if their absence would leave only silence behind. These thoughts were heavy, but they were shared, and in sharing them, the weight became bearable. What united them was not a love of death, but a refusal to surrender everything without resistance. They understood what conquest would bring to the land behind them: burned homes, broken families, a future decided by strangers. Standing here meant giving those they loved a chance, however small. When scouts returned with clearer estimates, the truth could no longer be softened. The enemy was not merely larger, it was overwhelming. The number spread through the ranks in whispers, then settled into grim silence. 100,000. The words felt unreal, yet undeniable. No one ordered them to leave. No one could. The choice rested with each man, and one by one, they stayed. They tightened their grips, adjusted their armor, and faced forward. They knew exactly what awaited them now. And still, not a single step was taken backward. In that moment, something changed. Fear no longer belonged to individuals, but became something shared,
diluted by unity. Each man saw himself reflected in the others, ordinary lives bound by an extraordinary decision. History often celebrates outcomes, but it is choices like these that shape it first, quietly, before the world notices. This was the calm before impact, where fate was accepted without illusions. Together. The enemy arrived like a moving horizon, stretching far beyond what the eye could follow. Lines of soldiers poured forward in perfect order, banners snapping above endless ranks of steel and leather. Their discipline was terrifying, not loud or chaotic, but precise and controlled, as if fear itself had been trained into formation. Drums beat in steady rhythm, not to inspire courage, but to remind everyone watching that this force never lost its pace. Each step forward was deliberate, crushing hope before blades ever met.
To stand before it felt like staring into an advancing wall of inevitability itself now. From the enemy ranks came a noise that swallowed thought. Horns screamed commands, metal clashed against shields, and thousands of voices merged into a single, overwhelming roar. Weapons caught the light in endless waves, spears rising and falling like the surface of a violent sea. This was not an army that hesitated. It moved with the confidence of something that had already decided the outcome. Against such mass, individuality vanished, replaced by unstoppable momentum. For the defenders, this sound was not just noise, but a warning of extinction approaching fast with every step closer than reason could accept or imagine. Across the field, the 400 watched in near silence. No drums answered, no chants rose to meet the tide. Only controlled breathing and the quiet scrape of boots adjusting their stance.
Fear lived here openly, hanging in the air, but it was contained, disciplined by necessity. Where the enemy fed on noise and numbers, the defenders relied on stillness. Silence became their shield, a fragile barrier against the terror rushing toward them. Every second stretched longer as the distance closed, and reality pressed harder on them with each advancing rank that filled the horizon before their eyes, without mercy. Psychological warfare had already begun before the first blow. The enemy wanted them to feel small, irrelevant, erased before contact. Numbers were displayed intentionally, banners spread wide, formations extended to their limits. It was dominance made visible, meant to crush resistance without effort. For many armies, this alone would have been enough to break them, to flee, to surrender, to disappear into survival. Confidence radiated from the advancing ranks, built on countless victories and the belief of inevitability.
They had never needed mercy, only momentum, and today seemed no different at all from the marches before this moment in history. Yet hidden within that confidence was the seed of disaster. The enemy believed numbers alone guaranteed victory. They underestimated terrain, resolve, and the quiet intelligence of those standing against them. In their certainty, they advanced exactly as expected, predictable in their strength. And in that assumption lay their first mistake, one they would not recognize until the cost was already unavoidable. As the armies closed, fate began to shift, unnoticed, waiting for the precise moment to strike. The 100,000 marched forward, unaware they had already stepped into history's most dangerous miscalculation, and it would soon reveal itself in blood. The mistake did not come from weakness, but from confidence grown too large to question itself. The enemy commanders saw the field and believed it belonged to them already.
Their numbers allowed impatience. Why wait? Why adapt? Why think deeply when sheer force had solved every problem before? They read the terrain quickly and poorly, dismissing narrow paths, uneven ground, and limited space as inconveniences, not threats. They advanced too fast, eager to finish what seemed inevitable. Units crowded forward, compressing their own strength into spaces that removed its advantage. Orders traveled slower as formations stretched, voices lost beneath noise and movement. The army was powerful, but no longer flexible. Strength turned rigid, and rigidity on a battlefield is fragile. Timing became the second error. Confident of overwhelming force,
The enemy attacked when exhaustion already tugged at their lines. Long marches, heavy armor, and constant movement had drained sharpness from soldiers who believed resistance would crumble instantly. They did not pause to reorganize or scout with care. Momentum replaced awareness, and momentum blinded them. Most dangerous of all was arrogance. Victory was assumed, not planned. The commanders expected fear to do their work for them. They believed the sight of numbers alone would break the 400. When it did not, confusion flickered, quickly buried beneath pride. To acknowledge resistance meant admitting uncertainty, and uncertainty had no place in an army built on inevitability. The 400 saw everything. They watched how the enemy filled the ground without understanding it. They noticed where formations tightened, where movement slowed, where discipline bent under its own weight. They understood that intelligence was not louder than force, but sharper. While the enemy relied on mass, the defenders relied on observation. This was not brilliance born in a moment, but clarity earned through necessity. The smaller force had studied the land because it had to. It had planned for pressure, not victory. Every step the enemy took confirmed what the defenders already knew. Strength could be redirected. Confidence could be exploited. As the enemy pressed forward, convinced that resistance would finally snap, the 400 adjusted quietly. Shields angled, lines tightened, positions shifted by inches that would soon matter more than thousands of bodies. They did not rush. They waited. Because in that single misjudged advance, the balance of the battle had already begun to change. The enemy believed the next moments would seal their triumph. The 400 knew something else entirely. They had been given a weapon far more powerful than numbers. They had been given the enemy's mistake. It was the kind of error history repeats when power stops listening. The field was set, the roles reversed, and the quiet defenders prepared to turn arrogance into agony, using patience, precision, and unity as their blades against overwhelming force. This moment would define everything that followed, because from this mistake forward, the battle no longer belonged to the army with numbers. From here, intelligence would begin rewriting the outcome of history forever. Steel met steel with a sound that shattered every remaining illusion. The first impact came like a collision between worlds, shields slamming together, spears driving forward, bodies crashing under momentum that could no longer be controlled. The air filled with screams, metal, and the sickening thud of blows finding flesh. In an instant, order dissolved into chaos. The 400 held their line as the enemy surged into the narrow space they had chosen. Numbers pressed forward uselessly, warriors packed so tightly that many could not even raise their weapons. Those in the front fought desperately, while those behind pushed blindly, unaware they were sealing their own fate. Every inch became contested, every step paid for in blood. Blades rose and fell. Shields cracked. Men slipped on soil already darkened by death. The defenders moved with practiced discipline, rotating positions, replacing the wounded, refusing to let gaps form. Each movement was deliberate, shaped by training and necessity. They could not afford panic. Panic would open the line, and an open line meant annihilation. The noise was overwhelming. Cries of pain mixed with commands lost in the roar. Time blurred into fragments of motion and instant. A strike, a block, a shove. Breathing became a battle of its own as exhaustion set in faster than expected. The enemy's weight never stopped pressing forward, an endless force testing the limits of human endurance. Blood coated armor and hands alike, making grips slippery and movements dangerous. Faces became unrecognizable beneath dirt and sweat. Individual combat faded into something primal, reduced to survival, measured in seconds.
Every defender knew that falling meant being trampled, crushed beneath bodies that would never stop coming. Still, the line held, barely. For every enemy pushed back, 2 more replaced him. The 400 were bleeding, tiring, and shrinking. Wounded men were dragged away, some screaming, some silent. The ground trembled continuously, as if the land itself protested what was unfolding upon it. From the enemy's perspective, victory seemed close. Resistance should have collapsed by now. The pressure increased. More weight, more force, more bodies driven into the fight. Confidence surged once again as cracks began to appear. The defenders swayed, their movements slowing, their breaths ragged. For a moment, it seemed inevitable. Shields dipped. A section bent dangerously under relentless assault. The enemy pressed harder, sensing the end within reach. This was the moment when history usually breaks the smaller force and moves on without hesitation. But something refused to give way.
Beneath exhaustion and blood, the 400 tightened their resolve. As the pressure peaked and collapse loomed, they prepared to answer force with something the enemy did not expect. Because just when it appeared the line would finally shatter, the battle was about to change in ways no one could yet see. What followed would decide whether their stand ended here in silence, or erupted into a moment that would echo far beyond this field forever, carrying consequences no commander had predicted or could control afterward. By every rule of war, this was where the story should have ended. Bodies lay piled where the fighting had been fiercest, and the ground was so slick with blood that footing itself became an enemy. Arms trembled from exhaustion. Lungs burned with every breath. The 400 were no longer whole. They were fractured, wounded, and reduced, yet still standing where they should have fallen. Logic offered no comfort now. The enemy still outnumbered them beyond comprehension. Fresh soldiers pressed forward while the defenders fought with failing strength. Faces showed pain openly. Some shields were shattered, others barely held together by cracked grips and raw determination. The sound of battle dulled into a constant roar, as if the world itself refused to acknowledge how close these men were to collapse. Fear returned in waves, heavier than before. Not the sharp fear of first contact, but the slow terror of knowing the body could no longer obey the mind. Muscles screamed for rest that would never come. Wounds throbbed without relief. Men fought through blurred vision, guided by instinct rather than thought. This was the moment when hope usually dissolves, when survival instincts demand retreat or surrender. And yet it did not happen. Something deeper took hold, something untouched by fatigue or pain. The 400 no longer measured time in minutes or counted enemies. They measured it in breaths and heartbeats. Each second held value because it denied the enemy another step forward. They were not fighting to win anymore. They were fighting to endure. Loss after loss struck their line. Familiar faces vanished in the chaos, replaced by gaps quickly filled. Grief had no space to grow. It hardened into resolve, shaping every movement. If they could not save themselves, they would spend everything they had to delay the inevitable. Despair pressed down hard, but it did not break them. The enemy sensed it too. Resistance that should have crumbled simply refused to vanish. Confusion crept into their advance. Attacks grew less coordinated, frustration replacing confidence. They were facing men who had already accepted death, and such opponents are unpredictable. Fear began to shift sides, quietly and dangerously. Within the 400, something changed. Exhaustion remained, but it no longer ruled them. Pain became distant, muted by purpose. They were still afraid, but fear no longer controlled their actions. Mental survival overtook physical weakness. They stood not because they believed they would live, but because standing itself had meaning. Each clash now carried intention. Every blocked strike, every step held was a declaration. You will not pass easily. You will pay for every inch. This was no longer a defense. It was defiance made visible. As the battle raged on, a question hung silently over the field. Unanswered but powerful. Were these men still fighting just to stay alive, or had their purpose shifted into something greater, something that no blade could cut down? The answer was forming with every moment they endured, shaping a truth the enemy had not prepared for, and history was about to record in blood and memory forever.
The turning point did not arrive with a roar, but with clarity. In the middle of chaos, when exhaustion clouded vision and the air felt too heavy to breathe, leadership cut through the noise. Orders were short, precise, almost quiet. The 400 shifted, not as individuals, but as a single body responding to instinct sharpened by discipline. They adjusted their formation to the land beneath them. What had once been a constraint became an advantage. Narrow ground limited how many enemies could engage at once, stripping numbers of their power. The enemy pressed forward blindly, but now their mass worked against them. They collided with each other, stumbled, and lost rhythm. Strength piled on strength until it suffocated itself. This was not reckless courage, it was calculated restraint. The 400 conserved energy, striking only when it mattered, pulling back just enough to draw the enemy deeper into disadvantage. Shields locked tighter, lines shortened. What looked like retreat was control.
The battlefield began to compress around the invaders, turning momentum into a trap. Leadership mattered here more than ever. Commands flowed clearly despite the noise, reinforcing trust at the moment trust was most fragile. The men followed without hesitation because hesitation meant death. In this shared understanding, fear lost its grip. Action replaced doubt. The 400 were no longer reacting, they were directing the fight. Environmental factors sharpened the shift. Uneven ground slowed advances. Fallen bodies created barriers. Blood and mud robbed footing from those who rushed without care. The defenders had learned to move within this chaos. The enemy had not. Each step forward cost them more than it gained. This was the truth behind the legend. Not superhuman strength, not blind bravery, but adaptation. Intelligence transformed desperation into advantage. Myth would later speak of heroes standing against impossible odds, but the reality was sharper and more unsettling. Ordinary men had read the battlefield faster than an empire could adjust. The enemy began to realize it too late. Confusion rippled through their ranks as progress stalled. Attacks lost coordination. Confidence fractured. They were no longer fighting a collapsing defense, but an unyielding wall that responded to every move with precision. The 400 had become unbreakable, not because they could not fall, but because they no longer fought alone. They fought as one decision, repeated again and again under pressure. Momentum shifted subtly, almost invisibly. The battle did not suddenly end, but its direction changed. Every moment the 400 held forced the enemy to spend more than expected. Time, morale, and belief drained away with every failed push. Victory, once assumed, now demanded explanation. As the clash continued, it became clear that something larger than survival was unfolding. This stand was no longer contained within the field. News would travel. Stories would spread. Empires would listen. What began as a doomed defense had become a lesson written in blood and discipline, one that would echo far beyond this ground, reshaping how power measured itself against resolve for generations to come. When the fighting finally slowed, the battlefield no longer resembled a place of strategy or ambition. It was a landscape of ruin. Broken weapons lay scattered among bodies that would never rise again. The air hung heavy with smoke, blood, and disbelief. For those who survived, silence replaced the roar, carrying a weight far greater than noise ever had. Losses were everywhere. The 400 were shattered, reduced, barely standing. Many would never leave this ground. Wounds went untreated, strength was gone, and grief settled in quietly. Yet even in exhaustion, they understood something extraordinary had occurred. They had not simply delayed an army, they had wounded its certainty. For the enemy, the shock was profound. This was not how victory was supposed to look. Numbers that once promised dominance now felt meaningless. Commanders struggled to explain why momentum had stalled, why progress had demanded such a brutal price. Reports traveled upward, filled with uncomfortable truths. Resistance had not collapsed, it had endured, adapted, and humiliated power built on inevitability. Psychological damage cut deeper than physical loss. Soldiers whispered doubts where confidence once lived. If 400 could stop them here, what awaited them elsewhere? Fear, once used as a weapon, turned inward. The myth of invincibility cracked, and cracks spread fast through armies and courts alike. Politically, the consequences rippled outward. Allies reconsidered loyalties. Neutral regions delayed submission. Enemies watched closely, measuring possibility where none had existed before. This single stand forced leaders to question assumptions they had treated as law. Expansion slowed, strategies changed, and caution replaced arrogance. The battlefield itself became a symbol, not of victory, but of defiance. Stories spread faster than facts, shaped by awe and disbelief. Some exaggerated, others doubted, but none could ignore it. Numbers had failed to deliver destiny. Intelligence, terrain, and resolve had rewritten expectations. For the 400, survival was not the reward. Legacy was. Their stand transformed them from nameless soldiers into a warning written into history. Empires remembered not just the cost, but the lesson. Power without understanding invites resistance. Force without thought creates opportunity for those willing to endure. Years later, scholars would debate tactics, formations, and decisions. They would argue about what truly mattered most. But on that field, the truth was simpler. Destiny had been challenged, and it had hesitated. That hesitation changed everything. The enemy withdrew, carrying more than losses. They carried doubt, the most dangerous burden any empire can bear. Confidence, once absolute, would never fully return to what it had been before this moment. The 400 had forced the powerful to look inward, and in doing so, reshaped the future. But this was only the beginning, because battles end, yet meanings evolve. What happened here would not fade with time. It would grow, whispered, taught, and remembered. And as the world moved forward, one truth remained clear above all others. The battle was over, but the legacy had only just begun. The legacy of this battle did not rest in territory gained or banners raised. It lived in memory, carried forward as a warning, etched into the minds of those who believed power alone decided history. Long after the bodies were buried and the field returned to silence, the lesson remained sharp. Numbers can dominate land, but they cannot command resolve. Military leaders studied this stand for generations. They examined formations, terrain choices, and leadership under pressure. Yet the deeper lesson was not tactical alone. It was psychological. Overconfidence blinds even the strongest forces. Intelligence, patience, and adaptability can fracture power that refuses to question itself. This battle became proof that strength without understanding is fragile. For empires, that truth is unsettling. Empires rely on predictability. They expand believing resistance will behave as expected. But here, resistance refused the script. A smaller force did not collapse, retreat, or beg for survival. It endured, adapted, and forced the powerful to pay attention. That possibility alone is terrifying to those who rule through inevitability. Stories of the 400 spread far beyond their homeland. To some, they became symbols of defiance. To others, cautionary tales. Their stand reminded smaller states and threatened peoples that delay itself can be victory. That holding the line, even briefly, can reshape negotiations, alliances, and outcomes. Time, once bought, cannot be taken back. Modern audiences still return to this battle because it feels uncomfortably relevant. Technology changes, weapons evolve, but human behavior does not. Arrogance still leads power to overextend. Smaller forces still survive through cohesion and clarity. The battlefield may look different now, but the dynamics remain hauntingly familiar. This is why the story endures. Not because 400 won against 100,000, but because they proved the world is not governed solely by scale. They showed that decisions made under pressure echo louder than raw numbers ever could. They turned hopelessness into leverage, fear into discipline. Their legacy is not one of violence, but of choice. Faced with certainty of defeat, they chose resistance. Faced with fear, they chose unity. Faced with annihilation, they chose to matter. History remembers such moments because they expose a truth many would rather ignore. Empires still study this battle with unease. It reminds them that every advance carries risk, that every assumption hides vulnerability. It teaches that power must listen, adapt, and respect the human element it seeks to control. Otherwise, even the strongest march toward unseen collapse. And for those watching now, the message lingers quietly, that even when odds seem absolute, outcomes are not. That small groups, when bound by purpose and clarity, can bend the direction of events larger than themselves. The battlefield may be gone, but the question it left behind remains, waiting to be answered again by history and by those who dare to stand. It asks whether power truly defines destiny, or whether resolve, when tested at its limit, still decides which stories survive and which quietly disappear across generations, borders, and wars.